Hello, hello. I just wanted to make a quick video sort of responding to Miniac's video, is Age of Sigmar a trash game? I think he raised a number of sort of valid complaints, but I think most of the issue that he's having with the game comes down to him being a new player. And in particular, if you look at the first 4 of his 6 complaints, which are complex list building, game bloat, widespread rules, and internal balance, I think most of those come down to a bad new player experience, which I certainly agree Age of Sigmar has a really, really bad new player experience. It doesn't steward people into the game very effectively. The other issue I personally have, and that I think contributes to a lot of the issues Scott was having, is that Games Workshop is dishonest about their game. Or dishonest might be a little unfair. They're not communicating clearly key information about the game. They often sort of accidentally miscommunicate something or communicate something that's not true about their own game, and that's confusing. And in particular, it's confusing for new players. And I think that's most of what's happening. There are also another couple complaints about flat gameplay and about needless risk, and in particular the priority wrong, and I do want to address those, but I'll just talk about his first 4 complaints briefly, and then we'll talk about the other stuff in a second. So his first complaint was complex list building. I don't actually think list building is complicated at all. I think the main issue he had is that it's never explained in a step-by-step format. And I think the reason why it's never explained in a step-by-step format is actually because Games Workshop has this odd commitment to the 3 ways to play design philosophy. And what's actually happening there is they have to write the core rules to be fairly agnostic to list building, because in open play, you don't really build a list, and in narrative play, I think you build a list differently to how you build it in match play. So they have to sort of write the core rules in a list building agnostic sense, and then put the other half of the list building in the match play section. And I really think, in my experience, or in my summation, what's actually happening there is that the communication from Games Workshop about the kind of game you're playing is dishonest. It would make more sense, for example, if the way the book, the core rules, was set up, instead of being like, oh, there are 3 ways to play, you can play open play, you can play narrative play, or you can play match play, and they're all equally valid. And I understand why they're doing that. They don't want to put people off or discourage people. But instead of doing that, if they said, okay, here's like a simplified version, simplified AOS, then standard AOS, which is match play, and then like additional rules for narrative or optional rules or something like that, then it would be clearer to the player that the standard rules are the normal baseline version of Age of Sigmar, and then you can play these other versions, like maybe you play the simplified one if you're learning, which would be open play, or maybe you play the narrative one if once you understand the basic standard version of the game, then you can go on to some optional rules and you can run a narrative campaign. That way they can write the rulebook to be less agnostic about which way of playing you're playing, and let's be honest, the way you're playing is probably match play. And they can just explain the rules like Scott is asking for in a step-by-step fashion instead of in the glossary format. And I think that would solve a lot of the sort of the constraints Games Workshop has put on themselves. And it puts them in a bit of a straitjacket that leads to a lot of these awkward situations. So list building is not actually complicated. It's just that it's not explained in a straightforward way because of this other commitment to the 3 ways to play thing, which they should just drop. Game bloat, I certainly agree there are a lot of useless rules in Age of Sigmar. Scott gives a really terrible example here. He says the most egregious example of game bloat is the pedantic "a wizard is a wizard" rule. Like anything with the wizard keyword is a wizard. I actually think that's a good example of a really well-written rule, but I certainly understand what Scott's saying. He's saying he wants like a simplified rule scheme that is written for people to quickly understand the game, and then you can have a comprehensive rule scheme somewhere else, so you can answer difficult questions or like unusual interactions in the game in a different space, rather than front loading and putting it all into the simple normal core rules. The main criticism I have here is if you design the core rules correctly, you often skip the need for this big comprehensive version, right? And so that, like, the best example I think is Magic, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So in Magic, if you go to the Magic the Gathering website, they have two versions of how to play, like literally basic rules and comprehensive rules. And in the basic rules, they'll tell you things like tapping, casting spells, attacking, blocking, the stack, stuff like that, right? The basic, if you wanted to pick up a deck of Magic cards and play against your friend who also has a deck of Magic cards, you could do this sort of thing, or I think they come with a little rules insert which also has the simple version on it. But if you want the comprehensive rules, you can read through them and they look like this, right? And if you just look at the scroll bar on the right, this is how big the comprehensive rules are, right? Just look at this scroll bar. Look how slowly that's moving, right? There are a lot of rules in the comprehensive rules, which I guess is fair because obviously if you treated each Magic card like a war scroll, there are a lot more Magic cards than war scrolls, and they remain in play, whereas war scrolls get deprecated and replaced by newer ones. So this is basically, this comprehensive rules is like every ruling on every FAQ on every war scroll forever, stapled one behind the other in a massive big document. So it's kind of fair that it's fairly long, and it's indexed the same way the core rules are indexed. They're put in a numbered format so you can reference them, and you could say to your friend, oh, remember that interaction that we came up with last game? I looked up the core rules and it was a 15.10 and it explains exactly how that works. But the thing that makes this wizard example really terrible, I'll just explain this by reference to flying. So let me find the flying rule. Let's touch flying. There we are. So this is flying in Magic the Gathering. It's a fairly simple ability, and it has these 4 lines that explain the rule, what it does, and then basically like all the exceptions. It's a really clean, really neat rule that has very few edge cases and weird examples because of the precise way that it is worded, and because they sort of got it right the first time. It interacts with the rules of Magic the Gathering, and keep in mind, they designed the card and they designed the core rules, so they should interact neatly, but it interacts with them in a way that doesn't cause extra problems, right? But that's not true of all Magic the Gathering rules. And the classic example, and the one they used on Warhammer Weekly, I think, is banding, right? Banding is a really weird kind of rule, and it takes this many lines of text to explain what banding is and how it works and how it interacts with a lot of the other parts of Magic the Gathering. In essence, it's actually doing something fairly straightforward. It is saying you can get a bunch of different creatures to sort of fight together as one big creature, but the mechanics of doing that are so difficult for the base game of Magic the Gathering to incorporate that you have to have an enormous amount of text to explain how to do every little thing. And essentially, I think the issue is not whether you have a simple rules, as in like learn the basics, versus a comprehensive rules. I think the issue with bloat is whether you have rules like flying or rules like banding. Okay? And Age of Sigmar has done a good job of having more rules like flying and fewer rules like banding. That's my main concern. I don't mind that the core rulebook is written with precise language in a sort of pedantic way, It answers questions before they even arise, and I think they've done a much better job, and I prefer them to continue on that way in the future. Again, I think the new player experience is a bit lost though. Scott also complains, not I think in his video, but in follow-up interviews on Warhammer Weekly, that the rulebook is written in like a glossary format. That's certainly true. This is a glossary format where you have all of the different rules and you sort of just find the specific thing and it tells you about it. Whereas this is written in like a bit of an order. Even this is not as ordered as I think it should be, where you would explain to your opponent, sorry, not to your opponent, to someone learning the game, step 1 do this, step 2 do that, step 3 do that. And the closest the rulebook gets to that is it's vaguely ordered in the order of like the phases of the game, I suppose, but it doesn't give you step by step much of the time. But yeah, I think that complaint about game bloat, and in particular his example about a wizard, is a very weak, a wizard being a wizard based on the keyword. It's a very weak example, and we have to focus on the complexity of the rules, and not the complexity of the outcome, but the complexity of their implementation. Widespread rules. Miniac also complains that rules are in many places. I agree that this is an issue. Rules shouldn't be in many places. The biggest offender is White Dwarf. The rules just shouldn't be in White Dwarf. There's no two ways about it. All your rules should come in one spot, and there should be a comprehensive explanation of everything you need for a game. A big problem here is that again, with like the 3 ways to play and with things like the General's Handbook, it's not even clear what like you have many options with how to play the game, and it's not clear which one is like the normal one. So back to my argument that there should be a standard kind of Age of Sigmar, questions like, what is the Season of War Thondia book? Right? Is that a General's Handbook, or is that like a separate campaign flavor book? A lot of people have no idea what that is. Scott said in the Warhammer Weekly video, he still doesn't know what it is. All right? There's a lot of books, and there's nowhere that tells you these are the ones that basically everyone else uses. And again, this is an example of Games Workshop being sort of dishonest about their game. If they were honest, I think they would tell you, look, most people play 2,000 point games. They play with the current General's Handbook. They don't use this Season of War Thondia nonsense. They use the updated FAQs, so you need to check those out, and the core rules for the match play section, right? Games Workshop wants to pretend there's 3 different ways to play and that there's all these different options out there, and that's fine for people who want them, but the straightforward, concise, non-confusing thing to do is to tell people that there is a standard version of the game and to explain all of the rules, a comprehensive set of rules that they need to know to play that standard version. Because it's very hard for you, as a new player in particular, to identify when there are rules that should exist, but that you don't know about, right? I said that in a really confusing way. But basically, it's that old trope of there are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And human brains are very bad at accounting for unknown unknowns. And if there are rules that you don't know about, and you don't know that you don't know about them as well, you have no reason to go looking for that White Dwarf and add in the extra rule that's meant to be in there. So I think Scott's just totally right on widespread rules. There should be a sort of amalgamation of them. They should pull them all into one spot, and you should have a clear picture of what you're getting into with buying different books and having different rules. He also complains about internal balance. I think there are a couple problems with the way Games Workshop measures internal balance, but I'm sure that what we see in the Warhammer community articles is very different to what they're actually using on their end as data. So, for example, in the article, they use a chart which shows war scrolls that have been used, and it's if the War Scroll is used in more than 5% of competitive lists, then it counts as being used. Otherwise, it doesn't count as being used. And the chart shows the percentage of War Scrolls that are used versus ones that are not used. Obviously, saying that, well, this was used in 1 in 20 lists is a very low bar to count as like being internally balanced. But it's better than nothing. I think the bigger problem is that there's another factor about War Scrolls for things like the Cursed City box set, which is a big problem for Soulblight in particular. If they make units in that box set really powerful, like Gorslav or Torgilius, which are quite good in the new book, then those War Scrolls are attached to miniatures that are locked behind a $30 paywall. You have to buy the entire, $300 paywall for Australians. Sorry, not $30. It should be $30 to $60 if you're buying just one model. And the fact that you have to buy not just that model, but all of the Cursed City stuff and all of the heroes from Cursed City and like the game board stuff and markers and tokens and rule books and everything else for Cursed City, when you really just want this one hero, I think that's a big problem. And the two ways to handle it are either don't give them more scrolls to use in Age of Sigmar, which is a real feels bad because they're in the same universe and they're the same characters, so why not let you use them in both games? Or to deliberately make those rules a bit underpowered, but that sort of ruins their statistics. And again, I think Games Workshop could improve this situation by being honest about the difference between these two types of War Scrolls. If they had like core War Scrolls where they're like, here, this is what we expect you to use in your army, but then also there are War Scrolls here from Cursed City and Underworld and Warcry, which we don't really count as part of your army, but we want to provide you with options so you can play with them, even in match play. Like if that's what you've got, that's fine. It's just that these rules might be a bit substandard or suboptimal, so don't expect them to play competitively. Games Workshop, I know, is really reluctant to do that, to say that we're just not going to balance these the same way. But I think being honest about that and just stating the intention. If your intention is for them to be equally balanced and equally viable, that's fine. If you want them to be suboptimal and not great choices, just so people can use them if they like the models, but that you're not forcing players to go out and buy a whole box set just to get a few models from it for their competitive list. Just saying what you actually mean to do, being honest about the game you're making, I think would help a lot. And it would help your statistics if you could exclude those sort of non-core War Scrolls from your internal balance statistics. All right. So that's mostly the poor new player experience and Games Workshop is dishonest sort of complaints. I think those 4 ones, complex list building, game bloat, widespread rules, internal balance, those are much worse for new players. They're problems that are improving over time. And the biggest thing is the main cause of all these things, the reason lists can feel complex, the reason it feels like there's game bloat, the reason there are rules everywhere, the internal balance problem is all comes down to this same thing of not really knowing what you can ignore, right? I agree, the game is bloated. There's a lot of useless rules in the game. And reducing the number of useless rules would make it clearer to the player what they're supposed to be doing. It would reduce that confusion and improve the new player experience. Because for people who've been playing a while, building a list isn't complex. It's very quick. The game doesn't feel bloated because you ignore all of the garbage War Scrolls and all of the garbage artifacts and command traits. You just don't see them. You look past them. Right? Even when I watch Honest Wargamer videos, he does a review of a battle tome. He'll just not talk about bad artifacts and command traits. It's like they're not even there. And it's sad that happens. That's a legitimate complaint that they write bad rules. But at the same time, if you're a competitive-minded person and you just know to look past them and ignore them, the game doesn't feel bloated because there's actually a lot fewer rules than are written in the book. Widespread rules, I agree, it's just always a problem, but same sort of thing. If you have fewer rules, you have less widespread rules, and the internal balance is again caused by this having lots of useless guys and not really recognizing when they should be useless and when they shouldn't. So all of those, I think, fall into this poor new player experience and Games Workshop not being upfront and not communicating properly to new players what is actually happening in their game. I did miss one little bit of explanation, and I've got a visual example for it. It's to do with the Warlord Battalion, and I was probably supposed to talk about this in the complex list building section, but I think it's the core battalions are a good example of a number of different things. So on one hand, you've got this confusion about what battalions to take. Most of these are useless. Like Vanguard, Linebreaker, Grand Battery are useless. Warlord and Command Entourage basically do the same thing, and Battle Regiment is the other one that does something useful. So you basically have two battalions, right? Maybe 2.5, because you could see Command Entourage and Warlord as being slightly different. And as a new player, you look at this and you think, well, this is very confusing. Like, I have a lot of options. Why does it look like most of these are useless? All right, it communicates to the player that if there's a useless option or a bunch of useless options in the game, it tells the player that they're doing something wrong or thinking about the game wrong, right? If you evaluate something and you think, why did the rules writers put this in here? Why does this even exist? Then you've done a bad job writing the rules. And I think the Warlord Battalion and Command Entourage are the best examples of this. I just want you to look at this battalion and look at what is happening with the slots in the battalion. So you get a commander, two sub-commanders, and a troop. Optionally, you can put another commander, another two sub-commanders, and another troop. But I want you to think to yourself, what are the benefits of using these optional slots? There really isn't any. With other battalions, the benefits are pretty straightforward. Like with a Vanguard, you can use the free command that you get on more different units. You don't get more commands, but you've got more options. With the Battle Regiment, you're fitting more dudes into that one-drop battalion, so you're lowering your drops even more. But with the Warlord Battalion, if you're actually using these optional slots, you may as well not use them. There's no benefit at all to putting guys in these slots. Same with this Command Entourage slot. And in fact, if you fill up the entire battalion, you may as well just take two different Warlord battalions, because then you get double the bonuses. And when you do things like this, it communicates to the player who's learning the game that there is some reason for doing it, right? You're telling the player that these optional slots do something, because if they didn't do something, they wouldn't exist, okay? But they do exist and they don't do anything. It's confusing and frustrating, especially if you're trying to learn, you're trying to build lists. You look at this Warlord Battalion and you think, I don't know what these optional slots are for. And I think you could replace, for example, all these core battalions, you could basically replace with a single rule that says, on your army list, note whether your army is unified or magnificent. If it's unified, then you drop in a one drop. If it's magnificent, then you get an extra artifact or an extra enhancement or whatever it is. And it would basically function almost the same way. The main exception, I think, is that the Battle Regiment influences your list building and sort of shapes your army pretty dramatically. But I do want to talk a bit about that in the flat gameplay section. So, flat gameplay. Miniac's main complaint here is that all the objectives seem pretty linear and pretty straightforward. You want to capture objectives and your opponent is standing on them, so you want to kill your opponent to get him off the objectives. Basically, killing your opponent's army is really the way to play the game. And I mean, that sounds like it's real straightforward, but that is also the point of the game of most games. It's the point of things like Call of Duty or things like chess, or really any game where there's two adversarial forces, you can have a simple rule where what's actually complicated about what's happening is that they have access to the same tools as you, in that they get to react to what you're doing and you get to react to what they're doing. And so even though the goal is really simple, the thing you're playing is not the goal, it's your opponent. And your opponent is quite complicated. Especially when you've got an asymmetrical army and your opponent commanding them can do lots of different things with them. It makes the game very interesting and, in my opinion, very deep, not flat at all. From what I can tell, the purpose of objectives is to encourage interaction. I'm going back a step. I know he's talking about battle tactics, but I just want to talk about objectives and why we have battle plans with deployments and objectives and all that stuff. Why not just put all my units on the table, put all his units on the table and have them fight? And the problem is, if you do that, you get very stale gameplay, because the key way to win a fight like that is to do any amount of damage to your opponent whilst not taking any damage in return. It's basically to limit the amount of interaction you have with your opponent so that they can't interact with you. It creates a big feels bad a lot of the time. I think that's part of the reason people don't like playing against KO, for example, because the whole KO playstyle is to try and position your whole army in a way where your opponent can't interact with it, and then to kill a little bit of the enemy's force, and to just, through that kind of clever positioning throughout the game, essentially defeat your opponent without them ever having a chance to meaningfully interact with your army. I think that's why people don't like shooting or powerful shooting, because it has that feeling of not really interacting with the enemy. So things like objectives force you to interact with the enemy. They force you to move up the board and essentially miss position, right? If you're just trying to defeat your opponent's army, you wouldn't stand on these objectives, but you need to, as a way of sort of forcing you to interact with your opponent. I think that they had some problems after they added objectives, right? And objectives have been around since forever, but if you're imagining you're redesigning from scratch, after you've added these objectives, you have this issue where you can sort of get runaway scores. By doing well early, you gain control of a fair section of the board and you run up your score really quickly, and it's very hard for opponents to come back. And that creates a different kind of feel bad where the interactivity, instead of being too stalematey, is too aggressive. So I think they balance this out by capping the scoring from objectives. Most missions now are 1, 2, and more, so you can only get 3 points a turn, which makes it hard to run away with the scores. But then you risk falling back into this other problem, this initial problem of not interacting with your enemy. Now I don't need to go and get a whole bunch of objectives. I can have maybe 1 and 2 objectives and score most of my points anyway. So why do I need to interact with my opponent, right? I can play very, very defensively. And I think part of the point of battle tactics is not to give you alternatives to doing the main objectives, but to sort of force the tempo of play, right? To make you interact with your opponent at a reasonable pace. It forces those interactions. So taking objectives, killing opponents, I know those are already your primary objectives, but this forces them to happen at a tempo, at a pace, at one a turn. And I think that's more the point of battle tactics than providing you as like a secondary objective, something alternative to the primary objective. And if you think about it, I actually think creating an alternative to the primary objective is a bad idea. I think Scott explains this in the video. He says, well, maybe you need a retreat for a turn because you just can't hold the middle field. You need to fall back, recover some points, and just sort of like reposition and then go back in a turn later. So you need something like secondary objectives like battle tactics that don't rely on taking objectives and killing enemy units for those situations. But I think exactly the opposite. In a situation where you can't hold the middle, you can't hold the objectives, you can't kill your opponent's army, that's you losing. That's how you lose a war game, right? And when you sort of say, well, I want a battle tactic that says I can still win victory points while actually not beating my opponent, while not interacting with his army, not dealing with what he's doing, you're ruining the game and making it less interactive. You're moving us back to that stalemate where we can just sort of like play our own little game. I can play solo Age of Sigmar and not really care what my opponent is doing. I can just score my 1 and 2 and do my battle tactic, and I get 4 points, and I don't have to interact with my opponent's army almost at all, right? And in fact, if I just make it very hard for him to interact with my army, then I can sort of win just by making it difficult for him to do the same thing, right? It leads to what I consider to be actually flat, boring gameplay. There is one more advantage of battle tactics that I think Scott may have overlooked, and that is the list building version. Missions do this too, the different battle plans, but I think it's a less elegant way of doing it. But essentially, battle tactics encourage you to build your list in a specific way. And book battle tactics do this as well to some extent. I really dislike book battle tactics in grand strategies. And I can certainly see that from that perspective of wanting these side missions and wanting a bit of gameplay where you deny other people battle tactics in particular, having a smaller shared pool of battle tactics so you can sort of have that second game happening at the same time. I certainly see the appeal of that. But considering it from this perspective of forcing interaction with your opponent and adjusting list building or promoting a certain kind of list building, I think book battle tactics make a bit more sense. And what I mean by that is, if your list building says there's a battle tactic called This One's Mine, for example, where your general has to kill a unit, that encourages you to take a general that is very smashy, that can do a lot of damage and can actually kill a unit. If there's another one called like Cunning Maneuver, where you need a Galatian champion to stand on an objective outside your territory, well, that encourages you to take at least one Galatian champion, maybe 2, in your list to get access to that easy battle tactic. The book ones can do the same thing. The Soulblight book, for example, has a lot of easy battle tactics. They're probably too easy, but half of them rely on having a lot of summonable units. I think you have to have a summonable unit and then get it killed by the end of the turn. You have to have one that's in combat and have it still be in combat at the end of the turn, that sort of stuff. You have to return a bunch of models to a summonable unit in the one turn. So these things encourage you to take a lot of summonable units in your list, but at the same time, they've got a couple that rely on you using your general, to do a lot of damage, to kill things, or to heal using the hunger, which requires killing things. So in both cases, you want a powerful general with a horde of summonable minions. The book heavily promotes that kind of gameplay by rewarding victory points. And the main thing is that it shapes the army into a certain kind of shape, into an ordinary shape. And when I was talking about the battalions a bit earlier, I said I'd talk about them in the flat gameplay section. This is the other purpose of battalions. This is why you can't just have a rule that says, well, just pick between Magnificent and Unified, and why they actually have slots in battalions that do things. It's because they want your army to look a certain kind of way. They don't want to like fully ham-fisted force you into having it a certain way, but they want the armies to be to prefer being in this structure of like 3 heroes with 5 troops and maybe a behemoth, because it makes the armies fairer to each other. It ruins this problem of skew. And I've got sort of a memory. I used to play Warhammer 40k when I was a teenager, and I don't know if this is true or whether I was just bad at the game at the time, but my feeling was often you would run across like an all-tank army, and you just don't have a lot of anti-tank weapons. So that all-tank army just smashes you to bits. And then you would run across an all-space marine army, and you would have a ton of plasma guns, so you would smash them to bits because you ignored all their armor. And it became very rock, paper, scissorsy, and not just in terms of, oh, this unit is good against that unit in your army, but my whole army is very good against your whole army. And for a game like Age of Sigmar, where, you know, you're spending 2 or 3 hours playing a game, you just can't have the balance set up to be rock, paper, scissors, where you can just look at your opponent's list and sort of know that they're going to beat you before the game starts. You don't want that kind of game balance. And it was bad back with 40k as well. And so I think having things like the battle tactics that are shared goals and that influence list building, and the battalions that are universally good and that influence list building, I agree it can make it seem a bit more uniform, but keeping it a bit uniform helps keep it balanced, helps keep the sort of the play somewhat symmetrical while still allowing a lot of creativity and a lot of options in armies. And I think AOS has a fairly good balance of the two. And I mainly wanted to bring up that alternative view at looking at objectives and battle tactics, instead of just as a way to be like, well, I can't interact with my opponent, so I'm just going to score this battle tactic of going and standing in the corner of the board. I don't think that's a good battle tactic. I don't think that's a good way to think about battle tactics. And I don't think you should want to do things other than interact with your opponent. So the best battle tactics, I agree, might be other things that are hard to do normally or that your opponent can counter. I like things like desecrate their lands, because your opponent has counterplay for desecrate their lands. If they're mindful about the placement of their units and they can have units guarding terrain pieces in their territory, they can lock out that battle tactic, and it's a different way of interacting with your opponent. Rather than destroying interaction by providing you alternatives to interaction, they should encourage more levels and new ways to interact with your opponent. All right, I hope that wasn't too confusing. It is a bit confusing. Let me just take 1 second to have a drink and we'll move on. All right, so the last thing to talk about is needless risk. And Scott talks about a number of different things here. The main thing he's talking about is the priority roll. But some of the other stuff I agree with. He brings up magic as another example of needless risk. Magic is very poorly balanced in Age of Sigmar. If you look at just the stats on it, most of the time your casting value is going to be below 7. And your opponent's unbind value is on average going to be a 7. Which I guess because you beat ties may as well be a 6. So the casting value as a default of any spell is about 6. Statistically, you win ties as the caster, but then again, if you roll below the casting value, your opponent's unbinding roll could be a 2, and it doesn't matter because the casting value is going to be higher than it. Essentially, I'm not explaining this the best, but essentially, casting a spell is about a 50% chance. Without any pluses or whatever, you have about a 50-50 chance of a spell working. And from my perspective, that is just not a very fun way to play an army, to have a whole bunch of things that could be pivotal for your army just happen on a 4-up. Right? It's fine if they're not pivotal, if they're not like a thing you're trying to build a strategy around. But for some armies, they really do have these pivotal abilities and then very few bonuses to casting. So I think the old Soulblight book used to rely heavily on Van Hel's Dance, but then the only way to get a good casting bonus on your Necromancer was to make him the General and give him Master of Magic, which is not even in our book. So I agree, a lot of the time you're rolling dice and the dice rolling just doesn't seem to have been thought out very well. Basically, every time you roll a d6 for damage or a d6 for a number of attacks, I think the same thing is happening. The d6 on redeploy is very swingy, and a lot of the time, these things I think could be smoothed out a bit. Instead of being d6, could be 2d3, or could be 2 plus a d3 or something like that. That's just my preference. I know some people prefer the swinginess, and it, you know, reliability is its own advantage in the game, but I personally don't like the pointless random variation. I think things like the whole magic system, things like the example he brought up with Riders of Ruin, where you roll a dice and on a 2-up, they do D3 mortals, that could just happen. My favorite one of the rolling just for the sake of rolling is probably the Stormdrake Guard breath weapon attack, where they roll a dice and like on a 1 or a 2 the breath weapon does 0 damage, and then on a 2 or a 3 it does D3 damage, and then on a 5 or a 6 it does D6 damage, and you're like, hang on, statistically that's about the same as doing a D3 or a D6. I'm not sure, I haven't done the math in too long, but it's like they could have just made it one roll, but for some reason they want you to roll twice, and it's just confusing, and you end up rolling just for the sake of rolling. So I think Miniac has a point here with the other things that he talks about. Ignore the example he gives about fixing magic by rolling 1 dice and adding a casting value. Obviously we already have casting bonuses in the game, but magic itself is fair enough to complain about and needs to be fixed, in my opinion. It needs to be, well, it doesn't need to, but would benefit from being a more interesting and engaging mechanic. And I think it would be more fun if you could more heavily depend on magic working and not being quite so random. But those are fine complaints and risk tolerance complaints and that sort of stuff. The big meat of the issue here is the priority roll. And I want to explain a couple things about priority, because Scott doesn't like it. He thinks too much of the game hinges on it. He says like, well, how much is being decided by this priority roll? Like 70% of the game, that sort of stuff. So I think there are 2 big things to consider here. One is that the priority roll is a mechanic that relies on both players playing around it, right? If somebody doesn't think ahead, doesn't plan around the priority roll happening, it can make the game very boring for both players. And the example I like to think of is there's a board game called Dune. I think it's just the Dune board game. There's a variant called like Twilight Imperium Rex. And in both of those games, every time I play them with new people, and the first thing they do in the game is they give you a big stack of soldiers. And the first thing new players tend to do, they see they got a whole new army. You must get tons of soldiers in this game, and they just smash it into somebody else's army and just see what happens. All right, it's a normal, like, standard reaction. You're exploring, you're curious, you want something fun to happen, so you just try something and see what happens. What actually happens is you sort of ruin the game for you and that other person by destroying all your forces, because it'll take you the rest of the game to recover them. Right? It's not good for you to do that. It's a really bad tactical move, and it's a really bad tactical move. Like, it ruins your opponent's game as well. But you don't know that, you're a new player. The double turn is a lot like that. The priority roll works just like this. If you don't respect the existence of the priority roll and you position in a really bad way, you use your army in a poor way, you don't compensate for the potential of the priority roll, you can just give your opponent an easy win, or vice versa, right? You can, they can give you an easy win. And it's something that, again, if you're a new player, feels like the game is poorly designed. But at top level games, when you watch them play, they are doing a lot to mitigate what happens if the priority roll goes off. So when Scott's talking about there's a 70% chance of winning the game based on this roll, a good player looks at that and says, I can't stand giving my opponent a 70% chance to win if they just based on this dice roll. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mitigate that chance, right? I'm going to expect a double turn, and I'm going to position in a way that really makes it hard for my opponent to capitalize on getting the double turn. And what I think this leads to, and I could be wrong about this, I'm not the best Age of Sigmar player in the world, but the way I see it is that there is a sort of attacker-defender posture that the priority role creates in Age of Sigmar. Essentially, if you're going first, then you are the defender, and if you're going second, you are the attacker, right? And I didn't mess those up. The person going first is the defender because they have to expect the opponent to get a double turn. They have to set up their army in a very defensive, careful way. They have to position screens. They have to use maybe spells that debuff the enemy or protect their guys more than ones that buff their damage output. They have to position a far enough distance away that the opponent can't immediately charge their screens and then charge the thing behind them, that maybe they have to use 2 turns of movement to get to them. They have to play cagey and defensive just in case the opponent gets a double turn. In contrast, if you're going second in the turn, well, you know not only that there's a chance that you get a double turn, but there's no chance that the opponent gets a double turn, right? They went first. They, if they win, they can go first again, but there's no way that they can hit me with 2 turns of activation in a row. So I can be very aggressive. I don't need to screen as much. I can be in range more with more units, and I really want to be really close because if I get the double turn, I want to be positioned so I can aggressively pile over my enemy and do a lot of damage to them. And my choice of things like spells, if I get the double turn, they're going to wear off anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So you can make different decisions about what buffs you're using and what positioning you're doing if you're going second than if you're going first. And I really like that that exists in the game. I appreciate the sort of changing back and forth and the way of thinking about what's happening. The only problem I have, and the bit that I agree with Miniac in, is even when you play really respecting the double turn, respecting this rule and thinking ahead and positioning around it, it is still possible for a continuous series of dice rolls to make it very difficult for you to capitalize on or to punish mistakes your opponents make. So, for example, if they're playing second in the round, they should be aggressive, they should be attacking, but for some reason they're deciding not to be. They're playing really, really far back and really defensively. Normally you would punish them by, when you win priority, you can just give them the double turn, right? And in my opinion, there's no better feeling in Age of Sigmar than winning a priority roll and giving your opponent the double turn. You're there saying, look, I think I've positioned so well and you're in such a bad position that you can go 2 times in a row and it won't make a difference to the outcome of this game, right? I prefer the chance that I get to be in the attacker posture now, right? But if you don't win that role ever, then you're kind of stuck being in the defender role, playing first, but not really being able to play aggressively because your opponent always has the threat of a double turn up their sleeve, but like keeps winning the role and never using that double turn because they're too far back to really take advantage of it. That, for me, I think is the worst situation, the most boring situation, because you're both just playing defensively and you can't really break out of it. I suppose there is an alternative here, and I always get confused when I try to think about this, but essentially it would be the opposite sort of issue. In that first case, your opponent is playing defensively when they should be playing aggressively. The other time is when they play aggressively when they should be playing defensively, right? When they go first and they should be playing defensively and they just move up their whole army, put it all in range and play really aggressively, they should be punished for that by losing a double turn at some point and basically being losing a priority roll and basically being crushed by the opponent's double turn. And sometimes that just doesn't happen all game. And it was incorrect of them to take such a big risk. And it is possible for them, and because it's a dice game, because it depends on dice, it is possible to make this mistake of either being too aggressive or too defensive, taking too big a risk on the double turn or on not getting the double turn, and then to just never have it, never be punished for it because it's based on a dice roll. And so I do see the issue with it. I do see the frustration. I just think it's not a plain like, oh, my opponent gets a huge advantage of going twice, because you can mitigate that advantage like substantially. And I like the incentives that it gives you to mitigate that. And when both players are playing around it, it's a really, really fun, impactful rule. But I do see the problem with if your opponent basically misplays, but then wins priority every turn, so you never get to capitalize on them misplaying. That's really frustrating from my perspective. And I wish there was some mechanic that made it harder for the opponent to win like literally every priority across the course of a game. Statistically, it's very unlikely for that to happen. But it would just be nice if either one change that I would really like to priority, for example, is if the person going second in the battle round wins the priority roll, if they're forced to take it. All right? That would mean that if they're not attacking, if they're not using that aggressive posture and not taking advantage of it, and the game is stalling out and not going anywhere, then they have to give up the aggressive posture, right? If they're actually playing defensively, then they should be put on the defense by having to take the double turn and sort of give that aggressive posture to their opponent. That would be one solution. I think it's a very small change and a really little tweak that they could try in like a general's handbook and just say, in this season of war, if you go second in the turn and you win the priority, you have to take the first turn in the next battle round. You have to take that double turn. I think that would be a really interesting change to see. Because the other way the game gets ruined by your opponent being too aggressive, I think at worst that just means then you're playing one turn each, and it kind of works out. It doesn't ruin the game nearly as much, in my opinion, as both of you stalling out. But other changes could be that there's a cumulative effect of every time you win a priority roll, it makes it harder for you to win the next one. Like maybe if you lose the priority roll, you get +1 to the roll next turn. But there are complicated reasons why that's not a good idea. Making it more predictable for the next turn changes the decision making, changes the influence on your current turn, and really you don't want that bit, right? You want players to have to play around the possibility of the double turn, but then once you get to the double turn, you actually don't want the randomness there. And that's why it's such a contentious rule. That's why so many people argue over it, is because all of the pre-priority roll stuff that you have to do to compensate for the randomness, to bring that 70% down to the 15% by screening properly and using your buffs properly and positioning your army well, assuming your opponent's going to get that double turn, reducing that risk, all of those decisions are really compelling and really fun and really enjoyable right up until the moment of the actual roll, and then there's a bunch of randomness that you don't like. And so it's one of those things where if you could just fix the randomness at the point of the roll, but without giving the player any pre-knowledge at all that it was going to be fixed, then I think it would work wonders. But yeah, I just don't think there's actually a way that you can implement that kind of rule. So my suggestion for the priority roll is just that small change of, if you go second in the battle round and you win the priority roll, you have to take the double turn. That's the one change I would make to priority rolls. And again, I'm not good at Age of Sigmar. It could just be that there's a way to play the game that mitigates this risk as well that I'm just not aware of. But for me, I find that a particularly problematic kind of play, where you really just sit back and do nothing, and then you're never punished for doing that because you always win the priority rolls. But other than that, I think the priority roll is absolutely excellent, and Scott is way off with his criticism, saying it's the worst part of Age of Sigmar. And in cases where it could be a really big role, I think that's because somebody has made a very big mistake and taken a very big risk that they shouldn't have taken. All right. I think that's it for the video. I'm losing my voice, and so hopefully that makes sense to everyone. It's a bit of a weird way to think about the game, as those like the battle tactics and the priority role just shaping the way you think about Age of Sigmar in that way, and about game design in that way. I think maybe Games Workshop has a very different set of incentives in designing the rules than when we as players are trying to correct them. So it's just worth thinking about, in my opinion. And I'm sure as Scott plays the game more, he will revisit it and he will see it as a much better rule. And I think he'll, like me, attribute a lot of his problems as new player problems, right? As a problem with Age of Sigmar as a way of explaining the game to new players, right? It's not good at inducting people into the hobby. You really need friends or something outside the like Games Workshop ecosystem to tell you the honest truth about what is actually happening with Age of Sigmar, and about what you should be doing in terms of like building a list and buying books and models and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I think that's about it for this one, and I'm glad I've got it, because I've recorded this video several times and I've hated it every time. But I think I'll leave it there with that one, and I'm curious about your thoughts, particularly about this attacker defender posture for the priority role. How do you think about the priority role? Because it still does my head in a bit, but I can see how it makes the game a lot better of a game. All right. Leave it there.